All right, I'll bring my guitar. Boker Tov. Today's daf is Daf Yomi testing about Mציעא. We're about 2/3 of the way down in the page at the two dots. Now let's turn yesterday's Mishnah to remind us. The Mishnah said if you find a get isha or a freedom certificate for a slave, daitiki is the written last will and testament of a person who's dying. We'll talk about that soon. Matana, a gift. Find a document that says I'm giving this to Yankel, whatever. Bishovrin or receipts. Receipts usually means you paid something. So in the case of a ksuba, what means the husband gave the wife the ksuba and she gave him a receipt that I got paid. Let's say you find it on the street. You don't know who it fell from. Like in this case of the shover. Did the husband write it in preparation for, did the wife write it in preparation for receiving her ksuba? And in return, she was going to give that to the husband. So that the husband, is that a receipt that he indeed paid? Or did she write it in anticipation, but she didn't give it to him yet because she wasn't paid? We don't know who it fell from. So we say, don't do anything with it. Don't return these documents because you don't know who it fell from. Because I say possibly they were written, but they weren't executed. You didn't give it. For example, yesterday we talked about the get isha. You find the get isha in the street and it says, Reuven's divorcing Rivka. Do you give it back to Rivka? Do you give it back to Reuven? What do you do with it? So it says, no, maybe he didn't give it. So the Gemara said, yeah, because he says maybe he changed. But let's say he says, give it to her now. Do you give it? So he said, it depends. Is it possible that it fell from another Reuven and Rivka? Maybe somebody else, was there a lot of traffic there? Or was it known that two people existed in that time with the same names? There were two Reuven and Rivkas, many Reuven and Rivkas. Maybe this Reuven Rivka divorced his wife, maybe another Reuven Rivka. So it depended on that. That's what we discussed. And at the end, on today's daf, we discussed, what about Lekucha Shelo Kedin? So he said, she'd have to take a proof when she was divorced. Fine. But that was the get isha. What about the other cases? What about Shechuri Avadim? That's what we're going to deal with now. Shechuri Avadim, Tanur Rabbanan. So in some of these cases, there are actually 5 cases. If you look at the Mishnah, get isha, shechur avadim, daitiki matan and shovrim. So it says, don't return it because you don't know who it dropped from. But it's mashma. Let's say, maybe he wrote it and he decided not to give it, right? In each case, the person that he's giving it to is the zakai, the person who would benefit, right? The get isha, she was not in a schus for her, but let's say she would be the person in whose benefit it was written. It was written in her behalf. A shechur avadim for the evet, the daitiki for the heirs of whoever the shemar was giving it to. Matana, the doni, the shover, that would be given to the husband in a case of a ksuba. In all these cases, we don't know who dropped it, so you say don't return it. It's mashma though. If the person who wrote it says give it to them, you would. So in the get isha, we said it depends. If there's a possibility that it was a different Reuven and Rivka, you don't give it back to them at all. Even if he says give it to her, because we don't know if this is the one that was up. So we said, okay, let's say you have real proof. Let's say there's a simon on it. The guy knows this is the get. Okay, fine. In those cases, you can give it to her. What about shechur avadim? You find a freedom certificate of a slave. So the Mishnah says you don't know if you don't know if the slave got it or not. Okay, but let's say he says give it to him. I let him free him. So why not? And the Brisa says that right away. You don't even need the Mishnah to make the deal. We have a famous Brisa which says, you find it in the marketplace. You find a shtar that says that the master freed the slave. There's mansha Rav Moda. If the master is Moda, Yachshaliv give it to him, which is mashma from our Mishnah also, right? The Mishnah says we're afraid maybe he wrote it. Maybe he wrote him his freedom certificate, but he didn't give it to him. Okay. Maybe that's why you don't give it to the slave, because maybe the master wrote it, but he never executed. He decided to change his mind. Says, I need him for another season. A lot of cotton to pick here. I'm not going to give him his freedom. Okay, so but let's say the master says give it, you give it to him, right? If the master says no, I didn't give it his freedom, I was about to, but you don't give it back to either one. There's mansha Rav Moda Mia Yachsa, but with Rav's motive, if the master says give it to me, give it to him, Levet, but why Listen to this case. Nisan comes before Tishrei. We're having Nisan next month, right? And Tishrei is in 6 months afterwards. Maybe in Nisan, but he didn't give him his freedom until Tishrei. Now, if he didn't give him his freedom, anything that the Eved has belongs to the master. Now the Eved went and he got some money. Somebody gave him some money outside that the master can't own it. The Eved bought some assets. Now, if the Eved belongs to the master, it belongs to the master. But if the Eved is free, it belongs to him. Okay, during that interim period between the time that the shtar was written and the time that it was given, and the master went and he sold them. He sold them, saying they're mine. He's my Eved still. I didn't give him his freedom. And then what's going to happen afterwards? The Eved, when he got his freedom in Tishrei, that's what's our concern, that you're going to give the Eved his freedom, right? Now the Eved gets his freedom. It says it was written back in Nisan, because what happened? When did he really get his freedom? In Tishrei. So anything that he bought and sold in between, that he bought or sold in between, or let's say that he bought, belongs to the master, and the master sold the stuff, right? But what's going to happen when you look at the shtar? The shtar says he got his freedom in Nisan. So what's going to happen? So now they're going to say, wait a minute, anything that the master sold, he had no right to sell because the guy was already free back in Nisan. And you're going to be tarf l'kuch shelo kedin. There's no problem taking away something l'kuch if you have a prior lien. If there's three people who have a lien, the first person who has a lien, he has rights to it. You can take it away from him. But here it's shelo kedin because he didn't really, at that point, you're going to take away from l'kuchas, but l'kuchas had the right to it because he didn't have his freedom. So ani chalaman domer, listen to this. Is it a schus for an Eved to be free or not? You think he got his freedom, right? Freedom. But sometimes people are what we call institutionalized, right? They want to be under them. They don't want to have to worry about it. It's hard to get your freedom. You're used to the food coming automatically. You don't have to make a living. You don't have to pay for room and board. And if in case of an Eved, he can hang around with the shifchas over there. They're very, very inviting. He doesn't have to, if he gets his freedom, he's a full Jew. He has to, get married properly. He can't live with a shifcha anymore, etc. So if you say it's good for his freedom, we had back on your gimel. As soon as they signed on it, they acquire for him his freedom. Now, the truth is, what do you mean? He has to get his freedom nasum biyado. He has to give, just like we learned from Isha. Yes, but Rashi points out that once he gets his once he's given the get, it's retroactive to the time that it was written. So if you say, fine, we don't care if he only got it in Tishrei. He got his freedom in Nisan. And if he got his freedom in Nisan, right, then that's his freedom. He's entitled to buy and sell. The Baal, the master, has no rights to buy and sell. So fine, then there won't be any problem. In other words, why, when you find this document in the street, this shtar shifra, and the master says, give it to him. Why do you give it to him? Why aren't you worried about there's going to be some sort of a hanky-panky over here? He wrote it in Nisan, gave it in Tishrei, and in between, the slave bought stuff and the seller sold it, and you're going to take it away from L'kucha Shelo Kedin. He's going to make some money over here. No. What's the problem? Even if he gave it to him in Tishrei, he's still divorced or got his freedom back in Nisan. That's if you hold that way. But if you say no, it's not a merit, it's a demerit for an Eved to get his freedom, because like I said before, because now he doesn't have any source of income. Now he's got to go fend for himself, and he can't fool around with all the shifra girls anymore. So Michael Mamer, what are you going to say? It's not a schus for him. He doesn't want his freedom. The fact that the Adam signed on it and it was written in Nisan doesn't mean anything. He's not going to get he didn't get his freedom till Tishrei, and yet it looks like he got it in Nisan. And any stuff that he bought, the master sold, will be cheated. Why? Because he's really only free in Nisan in Tishrei, right? When he got his freedom in Tishrei. So stuff that he bought in between and the master sold, it would be entitled, the L'kuchas would be able to keep it. Now he's going to say, no, I got my freedom and he's going to take it away from L'kuchas Shelo Kedin. So the answer is, Michael, what do you say? The answer is the Chiyas L'Mitra, when he comes to take away from the L'kuchos, the stuff that the slave bought between Nisan and Tishrei, and that the master sold, thinking that he had the right to it. And we're going to say, take it away from L'kuchos. Now, I got a shtar here that I was free in Nisan. I mean, we tell him, I see Raya Amos Mata Shechudachim. Bring proof when you actually got your freedom, just like we had the case of the Isha. Why aren't you worried there that there's going to be something, going to be an issue? You give it, if he says, if there's no concern about another Reuben and Rivka, and there's no concern about traffic, and it's their get, but how do you know when she got it? Maybe she got it only 6 months later, and the husband's going to say, okay, I'm entitled to the fruits in between. The answer is, we say, look, bring proof when you got your if it's written in Nisan, and the husband says, yeah, so she says, I'm entitled to the fruits from Nisan to Tishrei. We say, bring a proof as to when you actually receive your get. And the same thing here with the Eved, we'd say, bring a proof. You can give it to him, but if there's some issue about property that was between that, there was some issue about the property about the property that could have been dealt with after the date of the shtar, we tell him, listen, bring a proof as to when you actually got your freedom. Daitiki matana. So whatever these other cases in the Mishnah. Pardon. Yeah. What? That what? Presumably, yeah. Yeah, why not? I mean, there's no issue. I don't think it's any machlok. Okay, now what is a daitiki? Let's understand something. If you give something as a gift, it's done. I gave it to you as a gift. It's yours. I can't go back on it. There's no Indian givers. However, if a man is dying, it's called a shchimira. Special lacha, the rabbi said. We don't want him to be upset. So if he's dying and he says, give all my stuff to so-and-so and so-and-so, it's as if it's written and handed over. It's done. However, why? Because we don't want him to be upset that you're going to get a lawyer here and sign it and all this and contesting and all that stuff. We don't. Pardon?
There's no concern about.
Yeah, no, his mental status is that he's dying. If he could say that he didn't know what he was doing, that could be an issue. But let's say he knew what he was doing. He just knew he was dying. He knew he was dying, and he didn't have time to write things down and make a kinyan and all that. So that's a shchimra. Yeah, then it'd be a shota, right? If he would be an emes, if he didn't have a sense, then you can argue that. That's what they all say when they contest the will. He didn't know what he was doing, right? I am clear sound in mind and all that. They write that as if that means anything. Okay, so that's a shchimra. Now, a shchimra, sometimes you write it down. That's called a daitiki. You write it down. They can write it down because all he has to do is say it. However, here's the thing. He said it on the condition that he was going to die. Let's say miraculously they came in with they gave him some pills or some potion, and he lived afterwards. Then he can keep it. Because if he gave everything away, as I say, if he gave partial, then it's chal. But let's assume he gave all his assets away, and on the assumption he was going to die. Then when he dies, those assets are given away the way he distributed them. It's as if he gave them away before he died, but it's only chal when he died. Because if he didn't die, if he lived, he didn't merely to give it away. He gave it away on the condition that he was dying. That's called the shchimra. Shchimra's gift. A bari, a person who's healthy. If he gave it away, he gave it away. If he didn't give it away, he didn't give it away, but he can't change his mind. So the Mishnah says, if you find a document, that daitiki is a document of a shchimra, meaning he didn't just say it, but they wrote it down, or a matana. You don't know if it was given or not, so you don't return it unless he says to give it. Talking about ezeri daitiki. What is a daitiki? Dot he lemekim. It's an abbreviation. It's a foreign word. It means like dot he lemekim. This should be established. In other words, it's a velios. It should be established that this is what I'm going to do. She'im meis, if he dies, the chasav upon, he's giving everything away to Yankel. Matana, what is matana? What a matana? Kosher kosabo, you write on it, matana is, this is where really a will should be written, or with the effect of a will is, I'm giving it away from today after I die. After I die, it's chalam afreyas. What do you mean? That's the only case of matana. It's only a matana only works after death. It doesn't work below low kani one. I can't give it away while I'm alive. What does that mean? And of course, you can give matana away anytime. It means what's an example of a matnas bari which is like a shemira de lo kani lachamisa? What's an example of that? Giving it away today after I die. So with a matana, you have to, if the person is healthy, he has to say, which is a regular will. I'm giving it away when I die. It should be chal from before I die, from today or from right before I die. But shchimra, it's automatic that way. I'm giving it away under the condition. Kosher kosa, what is an example of a matana which is like a shchimra that's only chal after death? Kosher kosa b'miyam alachamisa. Okay, but the Mishnah said that you don't give these things. You don't give these things if you find it on the street. You don't know who to give it to. You don't know if to give it to the donor or give it to the recipient. Time in lomer tnu. Okay, because he didn't say give it. But if he says give it, if the giver, the donor says give it, nosen. For a minute, what's a daitiki is about this mercy? You find these kind of a document or a potike, collect from here or matana. Even though they both agree that he received it, you don't return it to either one. Why not? Why don't you turn it to another? Why? Because maybe he meant to give it to this one and he wasn't zochen and he wrote it to somebody else and we don't know what happened in between. In other words, even if you find a document and it says that Reuben is giving this to Yankel, you don't give it back to him. Why? Because that's what the document said. But maybe he wrote the document and he didn't give it to him. And in between, he gave it to somebody else. And now, if you give it to him now, what happens? He only get it now, but the document would indicate that he got it before the second guy. That's our concern. So how do you resolve these two things? From our Mishnah, and the Brisa says specifically, the Brisa doesn't really say it. The Mishnah is medayikit. In the case of the Shtar Shiur, we have a fair Brisa, but we say in our Mishnah, you shouldn't return it, because he didn't say, because we don't know if he meant to give it or not. Maybe he wrote it and he didn't give it at the end. But if he would say give it, you would give it. Why? Why aren't you concerned about this? Like the Brisa says, you find it on the street, you don't return it to either one. Lo kasha. Our Mishnah is talking about a shchimera. That's talking about a bari. Masnis and diktani ha'amar tnu nosim, which is mashma b'shchimera. The bar had remember a shchimera. When is it chal? Really, he's giving it away. Special luck. He doesn't even have to write it down, but you could write it down. But it's only chal when he dies. If he changed his mind before, he could change his mind. A shchimera can change his mind. Damrina and Michael, what's the concern in our Mishnah? Listen to this carefully. You find a document in the street. It belongs to a shchimera who's dying. And he says, someone says, yeah, give it to that guy. What's your concern? That he gave it to somebody else in between? In other words, he wrote it for number one, which had an earlier date, January, and instead maybe he gave it to number two in February. Maybe he changed his mind. So what's the problem? Michael Mamer, Dilma Kosov Kara Lahai. Listen carefully. Maybe he wrote it originally for this time to Imlach, and he wrote it for number one and he didn't give it. Right? That's the document you find in the street now. No, he didn't give it to him. And then he wrote it for number two in February. And he gave it to number two. He gave this property that he had to number two. Hashta kaharbe. Now what does he want to do? He wants to change his mind. Listen carefully. Wants to change his mind back from number two and give it to number one. Remember, he wrote it for number one. Didn't give it to him. Then he wrote it for number two and he gave it to him. Now he changed his mind. He doesn't want to give it to number two. He wants to go back to number one. Now he's going back to number two. Wants to give it to one. Even Matnas Bari. If when he gave it to number two, he gave it to him as a healthy person. In other words, he didn't write it like I'm dying. Because in the document, Rashi points out that in the document of the dying, they say man's laying in bed. He's dying in bed. Here, let's say he temporarily got better, and he wrote, "I'm giving it as a matnas bar. I'm giving it as a health person." Let's say that. There's not going to be any loss to what? To this person. The chinaf getarti, because when they both pull out their documents, because he can make a ma'aseh, because he retracted from his first. Notice, he wrote it for number one, right? He wrote it for number one. As a matnas shchimera. A matnas shchimera, he can retract, because it's not chal till he dies. So what are you concerned? That maybe he wrote it for number one. That's the document you found. And in between, he gave it to number two. He actually gave it to him. He gave it to him a regular gift. He says, I'm not dying. I'm okay now. I'm okay. The original document was only shchimera. Shchimera is only chal when he dies. So what happened? What are you concerned? That if you give it that, if you find the document that was written for number one, you find it now and you give it to number one, there's going to be a problem? No, because they both pull out their documents. Number one is January. Number two is February. So what's the problem? That number one is going to get it instead? No, because that's a shchimera. And that much he can change his mind. The second guy's going to get it because he can retract it. Even or if he gives the second one as a shchimera, also it's not going to be a problem because he retracted from the first one. So there's no loss. The second guy's going to get it because he retracted. So therefore, in our mission, there's no problem. Give it back to number one. What's your concern? That he gave it to number two, he changed his mind? He did. If he actually gave it to number one and number one dropped it, it's obviously his. But but your concern is that maybe he wrote it for number one, didn't give it to number one, and then he gave it to number two, and now he changed his mind and wants to give it to number one. So what?
But even if he doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because the second guy is going to acquire it anyway. So you can give it back to number one. Why? I bet number one is January. This one's February. Yeah, it's February, but number one was a shchimera. So if he gave it to number two in February, that's evidence that he changed his mind, which he can do. That's right. Kiktani, you never know. Okay, let's finish it. We won't have time to finish. Kiktani, the Brisa, in the Brisa, when the Brisa says what? That you don't return it. But Bari, that's speaking about when the guy was a healthy person. That's what we're assuming now. The Lav Armedi can't change his mind. That's why the Brisa says don't give it back to number one. No. He didn't say Lachamisa. He didn't say Lachamisa. He didn't. No. He didn't say. That's Matan's Bari. That's Lachamisa. even if it doesn't make any difference if it's Lachar Misa or now, because either way, you can't go back on it. So you can't go back on a gift that you gave because you gave it. You can't change he gave it to him already. He made a kinyan.
If he didn't give it to.
No, so let's understand the case. So let's understand the case before you ask the question. Let's understand the case. The second case is speaking about where the person, the Bryce is speaking about the guy's not a Shtumira. He gave it as a full gift. The Laban, he can't change his mind. Darmina and Dilma Koswell, what's the concern? Again, maybe he wrote it for number one. That's the document that you found. But he changed his mind, he didn't give it to him. Bahara Koswell in a Shachrina, then he wrote it for number two. The Yovle, and he gave it to number two. And now Hashtakarabe, now he wants to go back from number two and give it back to number one, which we decided. And we're saying you can't do that. You find it in the street, don't do it. Because maybe he gave it to Nuba. I can't go back on it because I gave it to him already. You can't go back. Even if he gave it to him, Irving, and he said, should be chal from today, it's done. It's done. He gave it to him. It's yours. It's only chal later on. It's like I'm giving you a future. On next July, you're going to get this gift. I'm dying next July, and then you're going to get it from today. It is a will. It is. You can't change. No, not here. Not here. You can't change a will maybe in common law, but over here he didn't give it as a will. He said, "I'm giving it to you." He made a kinyan. He acquired it. It's not a will. A shchimerek, you can call that a will. This is not a will. He gave it to him as a gift. The So what happened in this case in the bar? The guy gave it to him. If he's a healthy person, he wrote it for number one. Our concern is you found it for number one. That's the one you found on the street. And the concern is maybe he didn't give it to him. Instead, he gave it to number two. Now he changes, and number two owns it now, effectively, either today or after he dies, whatever. It doesn't make no difference. And then what? He changed his mind, wants to give it to one. He says, I can't go back on it. I can't go back on it. And I wanted to give it number one. I'll tell you what, I'll tell the rabbis, I'll tell the Bezdin, I gave it to number one. And they'll give it to him. They'll give him back the ksav, they'll give him the document. When they bring him out, this way I'll cheat and give it to number one. In other words, a regular person, he wrote it for number one, but he didn't give it to him. Then he gave it to number two. So who gets it? Number two. Now the donor says, I changed my mind. I want to give it to number one. But I can't go back on number two. So I'll tell you what, I'll tell them that number one, I actually gave it to originally. I'll tell them I gave it to number one. And then when number one and number two each pull out their documents, number one is prior. One was January, one was February. So what do you do? Therefore, you don't give it back. Ella, what do you do? Amrina, listen, Anan, we're not giving this one back because we don't know what happened like. Maybe because maybe actually wrote it, but you didn't give it to him. Maybe this document that you wrote to number one, you never actually executed it. You never gave it to him. And you gave it to number two, the Kahadras Bay, and now you want to change your mind. If you're telling the truth that you didn't give it to another person, and you want to give it to number one, we're going to give him a new document number one. If you're not cheating number two, if there is no number two, if you're really telling the truth, you wrote it for number one, and you gave it to him, and he dropped it. Tell you what, let's be safe. It's March now. Hey, it is March. Let's March now. Give him a new document from today. What's the problem? You gave it to number one in January, and you're giving it to number two in number one in March. So what's the problem? He has it anyway. If you actually gave it to number two, less babe seda, right? He's not going to have any loss. The kadam zachi. Number two, if you actually gave it to number two, and there is a number two, and you're trying to cheat number two, he won't have a loss now. Why? Because his is in February, number two was in February, and now you're giving him you're giving number one a new document in March, so number two is going to get it anyway, so he won't be cheated. That's why we say in the second brisa, don't give back that document because it was written by a healthy person, and we're concerned that he gave it to somebody else in between. If he's telling the truth, he didn't give it to somebody else in between. Give number one a new document right now. So there's one problem with this masculine was bid, but you can't say the second brisa is speaking about where's a healthy person. It says daiticus. It says that's a matan of a shchimera. El amrav zvid, hava b'shchimera. Both are speaking about shchimera. Below kash, habei hababrei. In our mission, we're talking about where it's the shchimera himself who's still alive, and he's saying, give it back to number one, right? Give it back to number one. He said, okay, you can give it to number one. Because if he changed his mind, number two will get it anyway, because he's a shchimera. It was a shchimera. And even if he gave it to number two as a man's bar, the second guy will get it anyway, because this document that you found on the street is a shchimera. The brisa is speaking about where the shchimera died in between. Rav Shapiro wrote the first document. Then he died. Who acquires if he didn't give it away? Number two. Okay. Not number two, his son, right? His son. Baba Bray. Maseisen, the Mishnah, again, it's speaking about him himself, meaning the Shemira who is still alive, the Bar, he can change his mind. This is a shortened version of what we had above. He says, even if he gave it to another person, less like Pseida, the first guy, there's no loss to the first guy. The Kama Basra, Zachi, because he gave it to number one and number two. Number two gets it. Even if number two was a Bari or a Shemira, however you gave it, if the first one was a Shemira, he could change his mind. The Harabek changes my Mikama. Kika Tani Brisa. What's the Brisa? The Brisa says you can't, when you find this document sheet, you don't return to him. Even if they're both Moda, Lo Yachser, Lo Lazev Laza. Why? But Bray, the son, the father wrote it to the first guy. Now the father died, and the son wrote it to the second guy. Or maybe there's a second, we don't know. But Bray, Damrina, and Dilma Kasav, Abu Elahai. Maybe his father wrote it to number one, the father wrote it to number one, didn't give it to him. And after the father died, number two gave it, maybe his son, rather, the son who inherited the father gave it to number two, because maybe the father never gave it, and the son inherited and gave it to number two, we're at the first of the wide lines. And now the son, it wants to retract after he gave it to number two, and therefore it belongs to number two. Suber, I can't go back on it. Why would he want to retract now? Because he made a knunya maybe with number one, right? I can't go back on it because I gave it to him already. Emalu, I'll tell them the Abba Yavla the high. I'll say my father actually gave it to number one. Vanessa and give him the document. And then when he picks out the document, he's going to say that it belonged to number one. The Huzachi, I'll split it with him. That's why he wants to get around it now. In other words, he actually gave it to number two. That's our concern, that the father never gave it. He's going to say, no, the father actually gave it. And the father gave it, and here's the document. Now what are you going to do? And the father died, so the document was chal. Hilka Chamile, we tell the kid, listen, we're not returning this document. Why? Maybe the father wrote it, he didn't give it to number one. And you gave it to number two, you, the son, gave it to number two. Now you want to retract on it because you want to make some communion with number one. If you're telling the truth, that your father gave it to number one. Go give number one a new document. What's your problem? If you're saying number one really acquired it, so you write a new document giving it to number one. You're the owner now. If your father gave it to number one, he's really the owner. And if if he did give it, you want to give it to him now. Even if your father didn't give it to him because you gave it to him, and you gave it to another person, there's no loss. The kamo basra kamazachi, because whoever gets it, the first guy, because the first guy got it, either because the father died and gave it to him, or because you're giving it to him now. So what are you concerned? Not concerned. So therefore, we're saying we're not going to give you this document because maybe you actually sold it to a second guy who really owns it. Because your father didn't give it to number one, and you gave it to a second guy. Now you want to go back on it, make a new star. So if what's the concern? If they give him a new star in March, and the guy that the son possibly gave it to number two pulls it out, he's just going to be there first because they're both matnas bari, and therefore there's no concern. So it all depends on the circumstances. Tanrabana, matzah shover, but lots of leave. Matzah shover. You found a receipt. This receipt is presumably a receipt that a wife gives her husband that she collected her ksuba. You find the shover, again, Mishnah says you don't return to either one. But the Brisa says, is mancha isha moda. If the woman's motive, yes, that what? I got paid and I gave him the receipt. Yachshel about, you give him the receipt. You give it to the husband. Ain't isha moda, she's not moda. Yachshel is that you don't return to either one. She says, I didn't get paid. Maybe I wrote that document in preparation. He says, I'm going to give you your ksuba. Babe, make sure you have a receipt ready. Okay, so maybe, and she dropped it. So you don't return it. You return it. Why aren't we concerned about a knuni here too, like Nisan and Tishrei? Maybe she wrote it to give it Nisan when she was expecting to get her divorce, right? They were all fighting. These things don't happen in 1 second, right? She were fighting over a divorce, and she said, I'm going to divorce you. And she said, okay, let's get ready. This is the piece of land, the $200 that you're entitled to. This is the piece of land you're going to get. Make sure you have a receipt. She wrote the receipt, but he didn't divorce her yet. She didn't actually give him the receipt until Tishrei, later on when she got divorced. But meanwhile, between Nisan and Tishrei, she sold her ksuba. How do you sell your ksuba? You sell your ksuba for tovas hana, goodwill, meaning future. Meaning it's possible that she will die and there'll be no ksuba if she dies before the husband. She does not. So you'll sell it not for $2, for $20, whatever, right? She sold it in between. Umapik leila shover. Now what happens? Now when they got divorced, the guy that she sold it to, so he collected the ksuba, the piece of land that was obligated meshuba to the mortgage to the ksuba, and umapik leila shover. Now the husband's going to pull out the shover. He says, wait a minute. I divorced her back in Nisan. Here's the receipt when I gave her the ksuba. When I paid her for the ksuba, the deal's off. She can't sell anything. It's paid off already. I have a receipt that I paid her back in Nisan. What do you mean she sold you her ksuba? It was worthless then. Because maybe she really wasn't divorced yet. Maybe she wasn't divorced and she didn't give him the receipt until Tishrei. We hold up Shmuel's. I sell you an IOU. That guy over there owes me money. I sell you the document. He owes me $100. I'll sell it to you for $50 because you're buying it now. You can't collect it for another few weeks. And I mochel the loan. I can be mochel. That's what Shmuel says. It's forgiven. Because the obligation still, I'm entitled. I still have rights on that. That's the one. That's like Hegdish Shiur and Chometz is mafkim eshu. But here also I can be mochel it. That's it. You don't have to hold the Shmuel that you can be mochel it after you sold. If I sold you the IOU, I have no rights anymore. Very simple. What's your concern that she sold the ksuba to somebody else in between? She sold it, and legitimately, because she hadn't been paid yet and didn't give the receipt in return yet, right? Here's we're talking about where she has the ksuba in her hand. She shows I haven't sold it yet. So there's no problem over there. In a case like that, she says, listen, I still have the ksuba, but what? I didn't sell it to anybody else. But you know what? I did pay him in advance. I gave him the receipt. I still have the ksuba here. But I didn't sell it to anybody else. He divorced me. He paid me the money, and I gave him a receipt, and I still have the ksuba. Of course, she can't collect the ksuba because he has a receipt. But it's talking about where she has the ksuba, so there's no concern that she sold somebody else. Rav Amar, she has a receipt that she has the ksuba. Maybe she said, sometimes you could lose your ksuba, and he gave her another ksuba. So the fact that she has a ksuba doesn't mean she didn't sell one of them. Maybe she had two. We're not worried about that. But shover bismano Torah. The receipt goes according to the zman that it's written. We don't even care if this happened, if she sold in between, because since the receipt was written in Nisan, as soon as she wrote in the receipt in Nisan, it's chal from that point. Take a look at the last Rashi before the Mishnah. But even if she sold us, less than mechesh l'shem makas v'l'shover b'nisan v'lo kibla ad tishrei. Even if, let's say, she wrote it in Nisan and didn't give it until Tishrei, when he gets it into his hands, but Tishrei, from the time it was signed, because that's a bayashita, that the Edom or Mazaka, the Edom acquired for the recipient from that point. The sale between Klum is meaningless. In other words, because she can't sell the ksuba because he already was receipted for the ksuba back in Nisan. The shover bismana kosabo Torah v'abayat goes according to this reason. Not only that, in the case, I was thinking also in the case of the shtar shichur for the evet. We said before, if it's a schus for him, right? So you're zocha for him right away. What do you mean zocha for him right? Don't you have to give it to his hand like an isha, get isha? So Rashi points out, he said by get isha, there's no thing about being zocha for it lemafreya. Get isha is only from the time she's actually divorced. But Rashi says on Amar Aleph that that in the case of the Eved, Rashi says if it's a schus of Tovu who etzlo shematir v'kivin the schuslo ikul etrutzi the mishar shenichtav zocha b'shichra the lechimota shtar get liyade when he receives the get nasa ben chor lemafreya mishas chasima. Right, you don't say that by Anisha, but by a get we learn it that a get for a Eved also has to be, you have to give it to him. But if you hold Eda B'Sum Zochalo and it's a schus for him, you could say, when he gets it, it's Chalim Afreya from the time of the Chasima. If you hold it's a schus, if you hold it's not a schus for him, so there we said, then you'd have to prove when he actually got the shtar shir, but otherwise it's not felt from before. All right, we'll pick it up from the Mishnah tomorrow. Did we settle everything? Let's
yeah. Before, and and you said there's no machlokas, that's what I was thinking about, that machlokas between Abaye and the other Mandomar, whether you're Zokin low or not.
Right. If you know that there's chus for him. Yeah. No. Oh, I don't know if you hold, I don't know if you hold like a buy or but the point is, it's you only hold like a buy in Yal Kagam. I don't know if that's one of the six.
Well, that's Abaye and Rav.
A buy in rubber, yeah.
Here's Abaye and Mandoma.
Okay, fine. But I'm just saying, even if we don't hold like him, the issue is, so if you don't hold him, and it's a chol for him, it's not a schus for him. It's only if it's a schus for the guy. So then you say you have to prove when you actually divorced. Yeah. But you understand the difference between it's not a gift, it's not a will. You know, a gift is I'm giving him. I can't change my mind. Once I made a king and I gave it to you. It's like I gave it to you now. I sold you something and I gave it to you. It's yours. You can't. There's no Indian givers.
That's how do we get away with?
Yeah, because you gave it before. Right. Yeah, but you didn't give it. Yeah, right. That you could change it because you didn't die yet, and it's supposed to be chal a minute before you died or something like that. You understand? In fact, I said that most of the poskim say even if you didn't have what's his name Fisher, the guy, the will guy, the lawyer.
If you're
Primer. Yeah. Even if you don't have a real halachic will, it still works anyway. If you have a Goyish will that a guy wrote you in Canada, it works because that's your intention is to give it away before. So he's saying it's can't be chalap to me. The answer, your intention is to give it away before, but it's not the same as a gift that you give because a gift you give you can't change your mind.
The last thing we done is the Shika.